Okay, I guess it's starting. All right. Well, welcome back to the show, everyone. It's been a minute, but I'm pleased to have our famous guest, Nick, back. Nick, you're definitely the MVP by now on the show, man. So uh, it's good to have you back as always. And yeah, looking forward to today's topic.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. And I appreciate the opportunity to keep coming back on here. But I do reject the title MVP because I feel like that belongs to the owner of the show, Christian Castellanos.
Thank you. I do. I do. Um, yeah, it's really good to see you, man. Really.
You as well.
So let's go ahead and get started. So for today's episode, we are going over the final chapter of The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. I'll go ahead and give a little lay of the land, and then we can kind of go from there. So Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, is basically a book on neuroscience. Um, this is kind of, and I'm sure I always say stuff like this about the books that I read, but I think this is probably one of the most important books in neuroscience, um, because of how robust it is in terms of the research that it draws upon. McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, I believe, by training, but also the breadth that it covers in terms of um, what he extrapolates all of these findings in neuroscience too. He goes, oh, so it's broken into two parts. The first part is kind of just the nitty-gritty neuroscience, psychiatry stuff. It's kind of all the empirical research findings in the science. And then the second half is his kind of analysis of basically Western civilization. He goes through history, philosophy, poetry, the arts, everything, and he is a very good example of what it means to be a learned person. I think it's truly exceptional. Um, and so today we'll be talking about the final chapter, which is his conclusion and kind of how he wraps up everything. So I'm just going to give a little bit about the brain, the hemisphere differences, and then kind of his thesis, and then we can go from there. So, and I had sent you some, I had sent Nick some notes earlier, so I'm just going to start from there. So yeah, Ian's book is primary again, it's focused on neuroscience, but it's primarily focused on the differences between the left and the right hemisphere. So he goes into a lot of depth about what those are. In summary, and this will kind of guide the discussion a little bit. Um, I would like to clarify at least how I see it as him explaining it. To me, the absolute most essential difference between the left and the right hemisphere is that the left is very narrowly focused in how it orients its attention and how it understands the world. It understands the world through very narrowly defined scopes. And it does this a lot through language. And in fact, the left hemisphere is where our language faculty resides. The right brain actually, in a very literal sense, can't speak and can't articulate language, whereas the left is the hemisphere that does. And so, kind of having this very narrow attention, it understands the world through dissection. And that's good. And that's basically how we get science and how we do science is by breaking the world up into smaller and smaller units, taking those apart and trying to understand and make sense of them. Um, but it leads to many problems. And so I'll give a few qualities of the left and right hemispheres. And if you want to stop me to clarify at any point, just let me know and I can do that.
I sure
Um,
will.
so there's he gives these at the conclusion. He gives alienation as a left hemisphere quality and engagement as a right. Again, the function of the left hemisphere is to kind of separate things and to make them distinct. And so that's where he gives that those kind of qualities. The left would be more abstract, whereas the right is more geared towards, or not geared towards, but literally helps us to be embodied in the world. Another very important distinction for the right brain is that since the left brain is very narrowly focused, the right is very broadly, globally focused in its attention. And he gives the example of schizophrenic patients who are very much, and it's kind of sad, but it's the truth, very much unable to feel emotion and to understand the world in terms of its actual contextual meaning. They report a lot of times hearing words and just so many different phrases in their head, but it's meaningless, and that's because schizophrenics generally have right brain deficiencies. And then he gives so I think that's good enough, actually. That's kind of the main point there. And I can go over that as well as we continue. Ian's main thesis is that both in individuals and within the culture as a whole, as time progresses, it seems that in the West, in Western civilization, there is a growing propensity towards left brain dominance. And the reason for that is that the left brain is intrinsically goal-directed, and it's also very selfish. And that's not even to make a value judgment of it, but it's just literally ego-centered in a certain sense, or self-centered. And that's where we get our goal-directed behavior. And again, that's not intrinsically a bad thing. That's how we, search for food, and, today how we look for jobs and feed ourselves and all that. But because of that very acquisitive nature of the left brain, he argues very strongly that in the West we have, over time, generally speaking, developed this propensity towards left brain dominance, where we, and in many ways, are in the position that we're in now, in Western civilization and global civilization and American civilization. He gave, if we could start here, I'd kind of like to start here if you'd like to talk about it as well. He gives a description at the beginning of the conclusion where he basically outlines, what would the world look like if we did develop this left brain dominant mode of being. And he says what civilization would look like. And to me, it was quite quite sobering, because I was like, wow, that sounds like literally exactly what's happening in our society now. This very paranoid, controlling, possessive, dominant mode of not just individual being, but of culture and society. And I could go on about that forever. But that's basically the gist of his book, is that in the brain, we have this acquisitive, domineering left brain that is unable to really understand emotion, connection, and context. And those are all things that the right brain is capable of and literally does as its main function. And in his view, the left brain has so much taken over the right that it is manifesting now, not just in our own individual lives, but in the culture at large, Western culture primarily. And then that kind of gets into the discussion of Orientalism and Western versus Asian differences in thought and culture and consciousness, perhaps. But yeah, I think I've given a very general outline. Where would you like to start? It's a long chapter. There's tons of stuff to talk about. But I'll let you lead the way.
Yeah. Thanks for that introduction. And
Yep.
yeah, I mean, let me just first say that like Ian McGilchrist is, as you say, a very learned scholar and in many ways kind of a Renaissance man in the classical definition of the term, right? Because he's a philosopher here. He is a scholar of psychology and psychiatry. He's a neuroscientist, and he has written this Master and his Emissary book with a very large scale um, and a very huge argument in mind. So he's not making a study of his own that examines or measures or assesses or evaluates one or a number of variables regarding brain activity using a specific methodology. He's consolidating and evaluating and combining and synthesizing 20 years of neuroscientific research into hemispheric function of the brain, which is one of the most like understood, poorly understood sort of functions of the brain, globally speaking in neuroscience. And through this book has become something a lot more intelligible and a lot more scaffolded out, right? This book gives a huge framework for moving forward in understanding how the different hemispheres of the brain work and what the implications of hemispheric asymmetry are on like mammalian brains and on human brains. And then he also, in creating this framework, has touched the fields of anthropology and touched the fields of like intellectual history and has touched the fields of the study of Western culture and of other cultures on Earth and of religion and of philosophy. And we can then turn to this as establishing these sort of foundations for very interesting studies into what it means to be human in a world full of humans where culture exists and culture happens. And I think that it's a very interesting and a very positive book overall, with a lot of interesting things and a lot of important things to say. I'm struck initially by um, something that wells up in me because of my experience with Asian studies and my studies into the problems that come about through Orientalism. This function of the left hemisphere of the brain as being alienating. The word that jumps immediately into my mind for that is othering. This left hemisphere brain others that which it experiences, that which it assesses and examines. It makes of it an other because in order to study the thing, in order to understand and break it down and categorize it and make inferences about it, you have to separate yourself from it and take on a role of, like of subject versus object, or of self versus other, or I versus it. And that process, that psychological process, and that sort of ideological and scholarly process is what is at the heart of what has come to be called Orientalism. It is people looking at, in this case, historically, Western people looking at people from Asia, from the East, and othering them and creating this I-it relationship, creating this subject-object relationship with it, and coming up with all of these weak and flimsy claims academically about Asia, and also misrepresenting and causing harm to materials and people from Asia and the history of Asia in Western scholarship, and fitting into a larger colonial machine that feeds itself and grows itself and falls victim to all of the shortcomings, or I should say, maybe all of the unbridled egocentric functions of the left brain, according to how Ian McGilchrist understands it. So, um, Orientalism is going to slot right in with his system, his framework here, and it makes a lot of sense. Um, there are some issues, I think, in the nitty gritty details, right? Like if I were to turn on my left hemisphere right now to look at just at the scale of his diagnoses of what's going on in Western culture and in the world, and what's going on among all or most humans, you can always like get really into the points and find something that challenges or problematizes what he's about in this book. But in so doing, I still think that one would still be functioning within that framework and would still be in some ways optimizing it or improving it or reinforcing it by correcting it or by expanding the body of evidence rather than challenging it and knocking the whole thing over and replacing it with something else. So in that way, I think it's a very landmark study. And I think that it definitely fits in with a lot of non-neuroscience stuff that we've looked at before. And that has been in the, scholarly and academic consensus for hundreds of years. So I think that this is, it's the next step, I think. And it's very synthetic in that it covers all these different fields. And so I enjoyed this last chapter, even if there were parts of it that I had trouble understanding and had trouble
Yeah.
operationalizing and had trouble making sense of. Those moments I just decided were, when I was having trouble reading and understanding and comprehending, I decided that's when my right brain was just sort of absorbing holistically what was on the page rather than picking through the steps and the pieces of the argument. So
There you go.
yeah, so this issue of Orientalism, it colors anthropology, it colors history, it colors the study of religion, it colors philosophy, it colors so much. And we have not, and I say we meaning academia and human society in general, we have not fully recovered, healed, decolonized from this big monster of Orientalism. It still hangs over our heads. My
Mm.
my parents, even whenever I decided to study Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, they still had this like mystique in their minds about like, oh, Nick is going to go find out and learn and understand the secrets of the East, the ancient secrets that predate Christianity and contain the secrets of
Mysteries of
enlightenment.
Orient.
Yeah, exactly. And like those things, some of those things are positive stereotypes, but positive stereotypes are still racism and are still harmful in their own way. And so, I still think that though there are parts of Orientalism that can be flattering and charming to people from Asia and to Asian history and to Asian religion and philosophy and so on and so forth, I still think that at its core, it's not appreciative and it's not like it's not looking at it as though it is an equal or as it is, its own agentive force in the world as compared to the Occident, which is the West, right? It's putting on all these biases that are applied by Westerners that think of the West as being all logic and reason and the East as being all mystique and secrets and wishy-washy woo-woo meditative stuff. And in that way, Orientalism reflects that sort of left-right brain way of looking at the world that Ian McGilchrist talks about, right? Like the left brain easily maps onto what Orientalists argue the West is all about. It's all about abstraction, all about categorizing, all about examining and studying and understanding through detail and through self-other distinctions. And then Asia would be all about holism and all about engagement and all about incarnation and meaning and context in the world and less emphatic on logic, reason, whatever. Right. That's just a one-to-one relationship between Orientalism and what he's up to here. And so I think that that being the case, there needs to be some greater detail and some and some more work done on the cultural side of this work, of this argument, of this book that he's written. But still, in that sense, I think that holistically, this is a cautionary tale about getting too getting to like or value as a society one side over the other, it cautions us against doing that because it creates problems. It creates many of the shortcomings or weaknesses of Western culture, and it can play into these biases and these stereotypes that people have about other places or about each other and even about themselves in their own society. So um, it's while it is like very sweeping and grand in its conclusions, it can often be this book be hard to challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that last part, but I'll say something and then maybe you could jump in
Mhm.
and reiterate. So I'm going to take a little moment here to kind of steal the conversation away for Vijñapti purposes. So
Absolutely.
in my 6 C's model of how to approach consciousness, I advocate for a few different things, but I'd like to talk about 3 of them here, 2 of which you've already discussed, and one which I'll bring up, and then we can kind of go from there, but it's not really the main point. Consilience and cosmopolitanism. You had said at the beginning of your assessment um, that Miguel Chris seems like a very learned Renaissance man, and I'm like, oh yeah, that he absolutely is. And he is integrating all of these different fields. Again, philosophy, neuroscience, history, the arts. I mean, he is an incredibly um, learned person and has this incredibly broad knowledge that I mean, and maybe that's a little bit of what you meant is like there were times when I'm like, I literally don't know anything about art history, so I can't say yes or no. But
Yeah, yeah.
that sounds good to me. And so yeah, he's very consilient, and I think that that is the reason that this book is so groundbreaking and has so much success, particularly for neuroscience. Another figure I think of in neuroscience is Andrew Huberman. I don't know if you the yeah, so he has this very famous podcast. He's probably the most famous neuroscience out there today. Um, he's very much a reductionist, and that's fine. And that's he makes a lot of good content by being a reductionist scientist. And he does leave open the possibility. He's like, hey, maybe there is God, maybe there isn't. I don't know. He, that's not what he's researching and talking about and has a vested interest in. But he is so successful because he has this very narrowly defined lens. Ian McGilchrist's approach is completely different. It's the exact opposite. Let's take a truly holistic look at life, at culture, at civilization, and see what we find. And I think he gives a very compelling case for the thesis that he's trying to outline. By the same token, cosmopolitanism seems to be playing a huge yeah, he takes a very cosmopolitan lens, especially in this last
This
chapter.
last chapter, yeah.
And I think that's the reason that it is so successful. And I would say it's a good example of how cosmopolitanism kind of allows challenges to be made in both directions. Um, and I'll get to that in just a second. The last thing that I would like to say, and I would just because I always like to give the other side as well. Um, one of the other C's in my model for consciousness is cosmology. And that's basically what is the context that consciousness is situated in? And I would say everything, the universe and how it's connected. And that gets into, potentially questions of theology. Is there something beyond what we can witness through our senses, through empirical science and data? And I think that there are exactly 2 ways to go about it. To say, yes, there is something beyond, and say, no, there isn't. It's just neuroscience. It's just brain activity. It's just whatever. I'm not here to make a judgment one way or the other. I just want to give people, the option and kind of the information, hopefully, to make their own decision or to go about making their own decision. I think Ian McGilchrist's book is the best example of the beauty and the profundity that a reductionist view of consciousness can take. Because although he does leave the door open at the end and he's like, hey, I don't know if there's something more. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. Maybe this is all just a metaphor for the inner workings of brain activity and brain function. Um, Even though he leaves that door open, you can still interpret this entire book from a purely scientific rationalist perspective and say, yes, phenomenological experience. And I love that he has this incredibly phenomenological lens that he takes to what he's looking at here, to these left brain, right brain differences. And he says, I mean, he doesn't really talk very much at all in detail about left and right brain differences. He's like, this is when you're engaged in this activity, this is your left brain doing that. When it feels like you're living your life like this, that's your right brain being more dominant. So I would characterize his overall approach, I guess, as a neurophenomenological or a phenomenological neuroscience, something like that approach. And it very much squares away um, with a completely secular view of consciousness, or not even secular, but just consciousness is in our brains and limited to our brains, and
An
that's it.
atheistic one.
Yeah, yeah. And I would say if you do have an atheistic lens or approach towards consciousness, this is like an incredible resource. And I think it's probably the best one that there is currently. And that's not to say that other people can't build off of that and do something similar, but I just wanted to put that out there because even if I don't necessarily believe this to be the case, I do want to leave the door open if for no other reason that, you know, whether the existence of God is not falsifiable. And so again, even if I don't believe in it, technically, if we're following the rules of logic and rhetoric here, then I can't say that it's not. But so yeah, I just wanted to say that because I really do value both the reductionist perspective, but still want to leave the door open for the emergent perspective, if that makes sense. Um,
Absolutely.
so yeah, back to the matter at hand. And so yeah, so where I was going with that is that we were just starting to get into Orientalism. I think this and the reason I said all that is it's interesting because as you were talking, like in my head, I was just going, oh, left brain, right brain dominance, left brain dominance, right brain dominance. And it's funny because like you really can make that case. And that's why I guess if I seem a little gushy about it, that's kind of why is that it really does offer such an incredible, thorough explanation for consciousness, for culture, for history. And that's not to say it answers everything. It absolutely doesn't. And even Ian McGilchrist wouldn't say that it answers everything. Many mysteries, many fields of research to be done, many experiences to be had, but that we can still turn back to science, neuroscience, and research like that, and give a pretty compelling picture um, for the mind. So I think you were talking about starting to get into Western and Eastern differences and Orientalism a little bit. How would you like to proceed? Because I guess what I kind of had in mind is that like we could start with you were talking about like Orientalism is kind of necessarily like a Western view of Asian culture and this kind of uh, dissecting it into something that it's not. And the thing I was thinking is, oh, well, that sounds like kind of the left brain, but also the development of Western culture in many ways, and the development of science. Um,
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So my bringing up Orientalism in this conversation, it's kind of two-sided. And what I mean by that is that it has sort of two. I think that Ian McGilchrist and the Master and his Emissary and Orientalism have two different kinds or two different potential modalities of relating with Orientalism. The first way that it relates with Orientalism is that it speaks exactly to the root cause of this like racist monster that has come up called Orientalism, right? It's speaking to like the original reason, culturally speaking, collectively speaking, why Western people looked at other cultures, other places, other peoples, and did that and said those things and created this whole body of material culture and academic research and of all this stuff that represents the Orient in the way that it does, right? So it
Sure.
speaks directly to it, and in that way they fit together very nicely. But then, at the same time, there's the potential that it also kind of can be Orientalist in its own right. And by it, I mean the book, Master and His Emissary. There's the potential that it's being Orientalist in its own right. And the reason why I claim that as being one of the potential relationships is that something that makes humanities scholars anxious in general, especially anthropologists, is whenever difference is observed, it is easy to immediately ask the question, why is this difference here? And then to make inferences about that difference that cover the scale of culture, of religion, of philosophy, of whatever. They can be grand claims. And those differences, because they're observed phenomenologically as different, they already bias the observer into thinking that that difference is fundamental and will remain if you drill down deeper. And that is really freaky. That's not something that we like to do. Um, Anthropology is guilty of having done this for 2 centuries, and for that reason, I actually I get anxious walking into anthropology or diving into anthropology as a field because it's just so hard to know if the compass is pointed in the right direction for sure, right? Like it's hard to know if we have fully come back around from doing that. And in most cases, better though we may be doing, we haven't as academics come back around from that. And I think that believing that that difference remains if you drill down deeper is sometimes true and sometimes isn't. But the practice of producing knowledge and comparing knowledge and comparing and producing and comparing material culture, textual culture, cultural behaviors and differences, religion, language, we just kind of function on the assumption that that difference is fundamental, and that can be very harmful because difference is the root of why Orientalism exists. It's based on observed or embellished or arbitrarily decided upon differences, and even sometimes fabricated differences that are fabricated because we've observed superficial differences, right? So we're talking about differences in skin color, differences in language, differences in everyday behavior, differences in religion, differences in, I don't know, social hierarchy and social grouping and social relationships, all these sorts of things. And so, as an example, something you included in your notes is that McGilchrist draws on Japanese philosopher Hajime Nakamura, who lived from 1912 to 1999. And he was a very celebrated, in his time, a very celebrated Indologist and philosopher of Hindu and Buddhist scriptures. And he was actually an interesting figure because he himself was very Orientalist. So I remember mentioning a minute ago that like sometimes Orientalism can be very flattering and very charming to people from the Orient. It can say stuff like they're very intuitive, they're very emotionally connected, they're very in tune with nature, they're very holistic, they're all this wonderful, neat stuff. He had actually sort of digested and internalized that discourse and started to be like, yeah, we are. And started to like read stuff with that framework in mind and examine stuff with it in mind. And his examinations covered the range from, in general, just phenomenology or Japanese philosophy as like an academic field, all the way out to these religious texts like the Pali Canon or the Mahayana Canon or the Vedic Hindu canon, all of that stuff. And he came to very grand arguments that were based on this like very deeply ingrained feeling of difference, or this framework that's based on difference that really started to get problematic at a certain point. And the reason it gets problematic is because you universalize this difference and you start to claim stuff like the Japanese are, the Japanese are not. And the most you could do really and get away with it is say some Japanese are, some Japanese are not, because there will always be an example that kind of goes against whatever claim you're making if you
Oh,
say
of course.
always or never.
Of
And
course.
so
Right.
it's kind of, and that's just an example when it comes to Japanese philosophy and potentially Japanese language. And so what's important to qualify all this with is that I know and I can see that Ian McGilchrist is not necessarily like endorsing the claims the Japanese are, the Asians are, the Asians are not, right? But
Sure.
is it a poisoned well to go into Nakamura's work? I don't know. It's kind of hard to know, really. He was also a landmark figure in Japanese academia, and his work is the water that we swim in now. And so I really don't know. And that's why it
Yeah.
makes me nervous, because like so many people have said stuff that has proven to be substantiated, and then also have said stuff that was like some of the most racist you've ever heard.
Sure. Yeah, and that's a good point. And it kind of brings up the question of like how much has Asian culture been westernized until this point? I want to speak really quickly, and I'm not, again, you're not like accusing Miguel Christ of like being explicitly Orientalist, but
Right.
I think he does actually do a pretty good job of giving substantial evidence for, and also, and he says explicitly of saying this doesn't mean that Asian people are right-brained and Western people are left-brained, and he's very explicit about that. And I'll give kind of the best piece of evidence that he gives actually to substantiate that, and he says that. Um, and he points out actually there are differences between the Western brain and the Eastern brain in the aggregate. And he says, and it's very interesting, and he actually, in a certain sense, refutes Orientalism, and that's kind of why I think he's really on the right track here. Is that he says it's actually not even a difference that Western people are more left brain dominant and that Asian people and Asian culture is more right brain dominant. Actually, right brain dominance or right brain functionality, the differences between Western and Eastern cultures are trivial. They're actually basically roughly the same when you look at the data. The difference lies in the dominance specifically of the left brain over the right brain, in which in Asian people, when we look at their brains, we see that they act in the aggregate, as you were saying, not everyone, but in the aggregate, um, their left brains internal to their own culture, maybe I shouldn't have said that, that their left brains are less dominant over their right brains than Western people's left brains are dominant over our right brains. And so
Mhm.
he, and so I kind of see that as a refutation of Orientalism in that way, because he's like, yeah, no, it's not, here's my Asian brain, here's my white guy brain.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
um it's more
A
nuanced,
relationship.
more subtle than that. And so I think he does give a very good again, almost refutation of Orientalism. Um, but that being the case, yeah, there's a lot to dive into with he brings up a lot of data and research and interpretation of Japanese culture. And I'm kind of hoping you can kind of lay that out. I've never been to Japan and I don't speak any Japanese aside from watching Naruto. So I'm not the expert here. So I'd like to kind of defer to you here. Um, yeah, what did you make of like all the Japanese culture stuff? And again, like now again having outlined basically his refutation of Orientalism, um, like what do you think that there are like substantial claims that he's making at the linguistic, the phenomenological, the cultural level in terms of language. And he gave, and if you don't want to start here, that's fine, but he gave something that I thought was interesting, which is that so obviously in English we have proper nouns and we have just regular nouns, and the proper nouns are more abstract. God with a capital G, or love, or whatever. Those are the abstract nouns, but the concrete nouns are can, shirt, computer, whatever. But in Japanese language, I guess they don't have that. And he was almost saying like it's almost like a Platonic inversion where in English we kind of grant primacy to the abstract, to the non-concrete, um, whereas in Japanese language, he was saying it's almost inverted. It's that they value more concrete things more. And again, in terms of cognition and perception, not just
Mhm.
making a sweeping general claim, but in terms of actual cognition and perception, that they grant more primacy to concrete things as opposed to because again, the right brain is what literally suffuses the world with meaning. Um,
Mhm.
and schizophrenic people generally have a very hard time feeling the world, understanding it. Everything is just kind of blech. And it's, yeah, here's all this crazy stuff and here's all these words, but they don't mean anything. Um, and so, anyway, I thought maybe that would be an interesting place to start if you wanted to.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the the framework that we're looking at here is the just so I can restate it for my own purposes and just so I can make sure we're on the same page. We're working in the framework of this interpretation that Western people tend to separate um, the concrete and the absolute, the principle and the you could say
Sure.
the phenomenon, the phenomenon. So there's
Mhm.
like you know these larger scale words that have a different grammatical status in English that are reflective of giant, huge principles, giant, huge ideas, ideals. And then there's also much more concrete, immediate, phenomenal things that we can give name to with our nouns that as we say, there's the difference between the proper noun and the regular noun or something like that. And then in Japanese, the difference is that there is no distinction between a proper noun and a regular noun. The distinction is that we don't in Japanese, there's much more attention, or I guess you could say much more acknowledgement given to the interrelationship between the absolute and the phenomenon, or the principle and the phenomenon. And
Mhm.
so um, and this is an important discussion to have because we've just been talking about how language is an artifact of the left side of the brain. Whether or not you like, you could reject everything that Ian McGilchrist says, but you still have to acknowledge that the language house is on this side, and that's where language originates, comes from, is
This side
understood.
for the viewers.
The left side, yeah, the left side. That's my left, yeah. um, yeah, and so like in that regard, you have to acknowledge one, that the languages are different. That is absolutely true. And then you have to acknowledge two, that the left side of the brain is where language occurs and is processed and happens. So then, as a result, three, you have to acknowledge that that difference lives somewhere in that part of the brain and has kind of created or modulated a relationship between the rest of the brain somehow. It has affected you could think of the brain in terms of these emergent domains or whatever, or you could think of the brain in terms of these very isolated sections that each have their own functions, or you could think of the brain as one large holistic sort of piece of meat. But in whatever framework you think of it in terms of, you have to acknowledge that there must then be, as a result of this like present difference in the languages and the function of the anatomy of the brain, you have to acknowledge that this difference has a relationship with the rest of the brain. So we've like started with the difference in the language, we've gotten into the brain and into the whole person, and we've seen like and acknowledged that, okay, there's a difference in the whole person between, the native English speaker who grew up and came to understand the world in terms of English and its language. And there's the Japanese person whose Japanese native language has colored their perceptions. I think that there is something to be said for that difference existing and for it having an effect in an aggregate sense on culture. So,
Okay.
what that amounts to in concrete is that this could be a locus for understanding the emergence of Japanese religions that, for example, you could say are animist, right? So we've talked about on this show lots before, Shinto. Shinto is not perfectly Japanese, nor is it perfectly animist, but it is a thing in Japanese culture and Japanese religion and Japanese history. And even if it isn't historically natively Japanese, and even if it isn't collectively, totally perfectly, technically animist, there still is this perception, one, that it's Japanese, two, that it's animist among Japanese people for the most part, except for those who study and challenge this. So in that regard, whether it is or it isn't, people think that it is, and they act as though it is. And so you could look at this and say, like, there's this emergence of animism that arises out of this different relationship between the left and right hemispheres. If we're to look into Ian McGilchrist's scheme and say, like, Japanese people or Asian animist people are looking at historically the phenomenon, be it rain, rocks, trees, rivers, mountains, thunder, lightning, famine, disease, pestilence. They're looking at the thing and they are inferring or valuing or otherwise cognizing that thing's relationship to a principle, to a universal or absolute principle, that gives it context and meaning and emergence. And that principle could be the kami, or it could be the Tao, or it could be any number of different things, depending on where you're looking at. But the thing remains that these religions in East Asia that predate Buddhism and Hinduism are very commonly animist or have animistic characteristics. And we don't have a lot of evidence of animistic religions in the West prior to Christianity. And one reason for that, of course, is that Christians destroyed a lot of that. But another reason is potentially this idea that there is this difference between Eastern and Western people for whatever reason. And so whenever I was mentioning about the relationship between this book and Orientalism, and I was speaking about difference existing, and then making the mistake of thinking that if you drill down, difference still exists. I want to make sure that it's clear that anthropology and scholarship in academia in general is not scared or upset with the contention that difference exists. but it does get nerve-wracking when you start to say, here's why difference exists, and start to make claims that apply functionalist biases or other biases like that. So, as an example, functionalist bias would be the bias that difference exists because the two different things have different functions. And that's based on the assumption that everything that humans do has a function, and that everything in culture then, as like an extension of the individual, has a function. It has the function maybe of maintaining relationships and cohesion in society. It has the function of encouraging reproduction. It has the function of whatever, whatever. That functionalist principle has really been challenged in a lot of scholarship, and especially like when it comes to religion, especially when it comes to non-Christian religion and like non-Western religion. A lot of this like functionalist principle has been completely broken down, because for one thing, like you can stay in that framework and say, well, some of this stuff simply doesn't have an intelligible function. There are practices or behaviors or doctrines or texts or something that don't have an obvious function. But you can also step all the way out of the functionalist framework or mindset and say that, these differences don't exist because of differences in function, nor do artifacts of culture, artifacts of religion, of language, of philosophy. None of these are like their deal breaker. Their reason for existing or not existing does not necessarily have to just be function in every case. It could be accident. It could be vestige, so to speak. And when I say vestige, I mean like maybe it arose for a certain reason at one time, and now that reason is gone, but the thing still exists, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, there's all these different ways to diagnose the emergence of difference, and many of them are scary. They're
Yeah.
scary to think about and start to make claims about.
It sounds kind of that functionalist view sounds reductionist, which
Mhm.
again wouldn't be intrinsically bad, except that, and I think now I'm kind of starting to get where you're coming from, is that um, then it's almost like, okay, like genetically, Western people are more logical and rational than all these other people, and that's why we need to colonize people and enslave people and whatever. Um, and again, that goes back to kind of the Western or the left brain dominant view is this very acquisitive, um, power controlling whatever. But is that kind of what you meant by? I mean, you didn't say it in this exact way, but kind of the risk we run, or the risk we run of kind of diving into more reductionist views is that then we come back with conclusions, mistakenly come back with conclusions that one aren't even true, but two, exhibit harm, onto the rest of the world from a Western, if we're starting from Western civilization. Is that kind of where you were going with that?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say it again and again. I'm not accusing McGilchrist of doing this,
Of
but
course.
it creates the danger and the risk. And definitely some of the sources that he has cited have done it. And um, again, like I have said, if if my uncle says some insane, crazy, awful shit sometimes, and then other times says nice stuff, do I have to like think of our whole relationship as poisoned? Right. That's like an open-ended question. So that is relevant here when it's like, if he cites this guy Nakamura, who I happen to disagree with, but he cites something that on its face is not obviously harmful, is that okay or not? Right. I think that's a question that scholarship is reckoning with a lot, especially in 2025, because just like most other professions, it is to a certain extent a slice of society. And so there's plenty of like very reality challenged, Trumpy MAGA scholars out there. There's plenty of them. There's too many of them. There's plenty of them. And so if they are like that problematic in their regular everyday lives, but then they say or make arguments that are substantiated in some way in their academic work, what do you do? Do you throw out the, as they say, the baby with the bathwater? Or do you like acknowledge that you are looking at, something that came out of a very harmful figure in the world? This is not just true now either. It's also true going all the way back to example World War II, where a lot of the science and a lot of the like medical knowledge that we rely upon now to save lives comes out of really harmful experiments and really harmful actions done upon victims of Unit 731 in Japan, for example, or of the Germans and the Jews and all of that stuff. So I think that it's it's an open question. There is no easy answer to ask, like, is the provenance of the information or of the knowledge um, implicating it as being good or bad, even if the knowledge itself is neutral?
Yeah. Um, yeah, that's a very good point. All right, I would like to take a little break. That's all right. All right, awesome. We are back. So very interesting discussion so far. I so we talked a little bit about the I think we kind of began reductionist, and that's fine. That's literally not even bad. I mean, we kind of needed to do that to lay the groundwork for everything else. Um, I would like to get a little emergent. I'd like to get a little cosmopolitan, if
Let's
you
do
will.
it. Hmm.
Yeah. So I've, traveled in Asia. You have studied Asian religion and you speak Japanese and you've been to Japan many times. Um, yeah, so kind of what I'm thinking we can do is look for evidence for and against, because I think it is very much an open question. There's gonna be times when the left brain, right brain thing kind of maps on very poetically onto, culture as we observe and live it. And then there's gonna be other times when it's like, yeah, I don't see a dog. I don't really get that one. So yeah. Um, Having traveled to Japan, what do you make of the overall thesis of these differences between left and right brain and differences in Japanese and American culture or other, I don't know where else you've been, but yeah, let's just kind of talk about our own experiences. I'm thinking a little bit of that kid you met that liked pizza. And I'm thinking,
Yes, Takuto-san.
yeah, yeah. I'm thinking like, yeah, that's not a very Japanese favorite food. It's a very American favorite food.
Yeah.
So evidence against. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, let's talk about it. What do you think in general based on your own experiences and studies of Asian culture?
Yeah, totally. So if we break it down like into things like language, culture, in as much as that is people's everyday behavior with each other in everyday contexts, and religion, just those three to start um, the conversation. I think that in language, there is an obvious and demonstrable and evidence-based difference that we had just finished discussing. So I won't go back over it too much again, but there's when it comes down to it, languages that originate in Asia in general, not just Japanese, but we're also talking about Korean, Chinese, Southeast Asian languages, and South Asian languages like Hindi and the various languages spoken in the states of India. Many of these are reflective of this different relationship between the absolute and the principle, or the specific and the general, you might say, right? The thing in front of your face and the idea, the larger general abstraction of that thing. Um, Western languages just have proper nouns. They just do, and Asian languages just don't. So that's something that you can't really challenge that much. Moving on to like everyday behavior, everyday culture as it is a function of how people act with each other. People who live in the West and have not traveled to Japan, or they have, and they are thinking about this kind of difference, they might harp on how there are different kinds of etiquette on public transit, for example, or on stairs, public stairs, or in restaurants, or something like that. This etiquette would be something like, you know, even without there being lines painted on the ground, you know that you have to stay on one side of the stairs or of the escalator to let people pass on your other side. Or bowing is
In other
another
words,
example.
Asian people have etiquette and we just don't, basically.
Well, people like that's what I'm getting up to is that people in the West like to
Okay.
romanticize that etiquette um, is reflective of some sort of fundamental difference in the relationship between self and society, self and the collective, individual and the collective. So um,
Mhm.
there's tons of examples like this, right? Like it's commonly very rude in Japan to, speak over a certain volume. You can just go on and say like, here's all these things that support this argument that Japan is more sensitive to the collective and will um, and will devalue or otherwise contextualize and immerse the individual in the collective in their everyday behavior and culture. I think that I think that there's just like a lot of rude Americans. I think there's just a lot of
Okay.
rude Europeans. I think there's just like a lot of rude Westerners. Um, because when it comes to these things like staying to one side of the staircase, I wish people here did that so that I could walk by them. When it comes to not being too loud in public, I wish people here did that so I could have a conversation whenever I'm out at a restaurant. And so like it doesn't have anything to do with like, oh, Japan should be romanticized for X, Y, and Z. It's more like, oh, I just think that like our values are different slash worse. You know what I mean? Um,
Okay.
it's not Asia is better. It's kind of like the West is worse in some ways. And it falls victim to these like left-brained sort of principles that we've been talking about through this whole episode.
Yeah. Well, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think that I mean if it does, but that kind of not plays into because it's like the actual science and the data. And I'm very
Yeah.
skeptical of psychology, by the way. So I as I'm saying all this, I just want people to know that like I do recognize I think I'm one of the more critical people of psychology, honestly.
Of
But
clinical psychology, especially.
yeah, especially. But he gives really good data. And so kind of what I'm thinking, and this is, yeah, we know each other. I'm not like dumb and crazy or whatever. Um, maybe a little bit. Do you think that, so I was thinking, okay, well, immediately what I'm thinking is that, yeah, Westerners have more left brain dominance. So it's all about me, what I want. I don't care if other people are annoyed that I'm talking loud or that I'm not paying attention to other people. And he demonstrates left brain dominance is characterized by very egotistical behavior. And that's what we have in the US. Um, and kind of what you're saying is it's almost like, and this isn't, I heard it as like that should just be the baseline. That's just baseline human behavior. That's baseline human decency. And so, in a sort of way, I thought of Buddha nature, right?
Hmm.
Like that is kind of just how human beings are. And I don't know if you said that, and I don't know if you um, mean that, but that's what I heard is that that kind of is our innate inclination is that, yeah, we are naturally, our natural state, let's say, is one of compassion. I mean, just even the basics of like, just don't be an asshole, that's kind of our natural inclination. And I think that even though Ian McGilchrist didn't necessarily say that, that's what bears out, or what should bear out according to his data, because again, it's not that the right brain is trying to be sympathetic and the left brain is not trying to be sympathetic. It's that we already have this sympathetic, compassionate understanding, and I'm not essentializing Japanese culture to that. I'm just saying this more, hey, let's help other people out, pick up the trash outside. Hey, let's pick up the trash so everything doesn't look crappy. Hey, let's be respectful to one another when we're in public. Um, that almost kind of seems like the baseline, according to what you're saying on the one hand, but also to what Ian McGilchrist's research seems to pan out if we take it to its logical conclusion. What do you think? Do people have Buddha nature? Do Americans have Buddha nature or no?
I think that all sentient beings do have Buddha nature. And that is the result of many, many hours. You could even probably collectivize it into and measure it in days of debate with our mutual friend Turner, who does not believe in Buddha nature. He fundamentally rejects it because the Chung Wei Shalom rejects it. So he doesn't think Americans or anybody else has has Buddha nature. But
Yeah.
but getting back to the topic at hand, you mentioned what I was saying was that like being polite in public is like minimum human decency. It absolutely is, and that is absolutely what I was saying. It's like the baseline. It's what should be minimum, but is not. And you did a very good job of diagnosing, like, yes, the lack of it is definitely reflective of the weaknesses or the shortcomings of left brain dominance, according to McGilchrist's framework. And something I wanted to add on to that too is that, okay, so this difference exists, and you might be able to use this framework to say that in Japan, the left brain dominance problem is not as big of a problem. But there is some nuance there that deserves some airtime, which is that our present culture, all of our present cultures, but Japan as well, it's the result of conflict and of exchange and of relationships that can also be problematic and indecent in their own ways. So, someone who has been to Japan once or has never been to Japan might say like, oh, wow, they're living in the future. It's so amazing. It's like a utopia. Someone who has been in Japan as much as I have, or for years at a time, or decades, especially if they're not Japanese themselves, would say, oh, it's not. It is not a utopia. There are huge issues, including, like, for example, this human decency really applies mostly to other Japanese people. It doesn't really apply to foreigners. There is a huge issue of racism against people from outside Japan in Japan. So, though there may be these superficial standards of politeness, these superficial standards of we all take care of each other, we're all collectively holding hands and singing Kumbaya and picking up litter off the ground. That might be like the superficial image that's trying to be projected, but the reasons that that image is trying to be projected are inherently ethnocentric and nationalistic in nature. And they are reflective of wartime sentiment that Japan should have been the emperor of the world, that should have been the top, the Ubermensch, the top culture, the top, the group of people, the ethnicity that should govern all other ethnicities in Asia, but also I think some people wanted globally. And so that attitude, and I'm not saying that all Japanese people who are polite in public are being polite because they're trying to contribute to this like giant racist machine, but but the roots of that behavior and the roots of that superficial image go back to very imperialistic notions. And the same is true if we look at Western Empire as well, by the way. It's not just Japan that works this way. Most of our Western manners having to do with like saying hello and thank you, or please and thank you, and having to do with what side of the plate the fork and knife and spoon go on, and having to do with not putting elbows on the table, and having to do with using titles like sir and ma'am or Mr. and Mrs. and Miss all correctly. All of that stuff is to a certain extent a product of Europeans doing the same thing. They're projecting, or in the past and to this day, began projecting images of superficial decency that they tried to purport went down to the bone and gave them reason to be, gave Westerners and European imperial powers reason to be the dominant culture on Earth. And so there's, I guess that you could sort of collectively regard all of that as like the imperialistic notion of decency, the imperialistic notion of manners. Um, I'm like, it's like Europeans or Japanese people saying, I am the correct way of living and being, and everyone else is savages, right? The diagnosis of savage is in itself part of, projecting and deepening that image of superficial decency. And so um, it's very common in Japan, and it was and is common in the West to look at people who don't, abide by those kind of arbitrary rules sometimes, and say like, oh, they're outsiders, they're others, they're savages, they're less than, they're inferior because they're not born here, they're not raised this way, they don't act this way. When the things that they're talking about sometimes are like actually genuinely decent, like staying to one side of a staircase so that other people can pass by you if they want to go faster. But putting the fork on the wrong side of the plate,
Mm-hmm.
that's arbitrary. That's nonsense. That doesn't make any sense at all. Um,
Yeah.
so, there's these standards of decency that are just used for exclusion. And their existence could be diagnosed as this left or right brain thing, but also we shouldn't ignore the history of their existence either.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think you could make a good argument that probably, Japan during its most recent imperial endeavors back in World War II and preceding it, that was a period of left brain dominance in Japanese culture. This very acquisitive power over others,
Mm-hmm.
greedy for resources, greedy for control, that would characterize, and that's a good, and again, I think that's why this book is so valuable in this discussion is because it really does offer um, not just a refutation of Orientalism, but a very substantial mechanism that we can outline even over other cultures that maybe appear to exhibit left brain dominance, but then we realize culture is not just a thing. There's not
Right.
just Japanese culture. There's Japanese culture in the 90s, there's Japanese culture in the 40s, in the
Mm-hmm.
1600s, and that this mechanism is a very interesting, I think, because you can look at different periods in history and kind of invoke it or attribute different cultural phenomena to left brain dominance. And again, I want to be clear, just so people really understand this. It's not a question of whether the right brain or the left brain is dominant. The right brain generally remains stable over time and over generations. And evolutionarily, actually, it seems that the left brain has actually grown in size, and the left brain
Mm-hmm.
is in fact slightly larger than the right in the aggregate across all people. The question is not, is the left brain or the right brain dominant? It is how much is the left brain dominant over the right if we're talking about culture in the aggregate, if we're talking about the individual, most of the time. Um, that is the mediating factor because
Mm-hmm.
again, it is to use Plato's term, the left brain is appetitive in nature. It seeks, it finds, it claims, it dissects, it separates, it objectifies. The right brain subjectifies. And yeah, I just wanted to offer that for people, because it's a very important. I think it's a very good way of looking at the world, but the mechanism is slightly nuanced in that way.
It's very specific. Yeah. It can be easy because one of the things that we talked about whenever we brought up this episode idea was this left and right brain research is really controversial. And it's controversial for many of the reasons that we have already sort of mentioned and gone over, including that people are prone to saying that X or Y is entirely or, majority left or right brain included or left or right brain moderated or something like that. And McGilchrist is not falling victim to that sort of colloquialism. Like you say, he's measuring a degree of dominance of left over right and contextualizing it in sort of global brain function and making arguments that apply to the aggregate rather than the individual. And he's challenging these institutions, so to speak, because in Western language and in Western colloquial language, I would say that left and right brain are institutions of their own. People all the time, everywhere in my life and just in general, are saying, yeah, I'm very left brained. I want to do X, Y, and Z. I want to be logical and reasoned, and I want to do all this. And then whenever someone around them is artistic and they make a lot of art and they're very creative, then the colloquialism is to say that person's very left brain, or I'm sorry, very right brained. So like that has become entrenched in how we view the world, um, kind of outside of the scope of McGilchrist's work. And I think that he's looking at all of this and correcting some of that for us in this work. And it's like moving a mountain, because it's we already have this sort of prejudice
Yeah,
about things, and it affects how we talk about the world.
yeah, for sure. I think so. Um, okay. Last thing, if do you have time
Totally,
to?
yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool,
Go
cool.
ahead.
Yeah, so you had mentioned language. Oh, okay. I had a burning question. You mentioned language, people's everyday experience of like being in a culture, and then religion. So I really wanted to talk
Hmm.
about religion. Before that, I would like to go back to language just for a little bit. So one of the things that McGilchrist points out is that the right brain is very geared towards metaphor, and that's how it understands meaning primarily is through um, well, that metaphor is the manifestation of how the right brain interprets the world due to its intrinsic lack of language.
Hmm.
The left brain is very literal, the right brain is very metaphorical. And in everyday life, the metaphorical is just as important, if not more important than the actual literal. Um, yeah, that's um, this isn't a. People always say 70%, 90% body language is language. No one can say exactly how much, obviously, but that it's a lot is the point, and that's a very right brain thing. Um, he gave an example where he showed that Chinese people in general like metaphors or like sayings that are very paradoxical, and that Americans prefer ones that are very straightforward and linear. And the one that he gave that was a Chinese saying is too humble, half proud. And I was like, oh, that's very like wise and so it's like it sounds like the classic like wise Confucius quotes if you Google that when you're like 12 years old and you get that back. And then the American one was uh half a loaf of bread is better than no bread at all. And I was like, okay, that's not very creative and it's very literal. And anyway, as a self-proclaimed weeb who listens to a lot of anime and J-pop and stuff like that, whenever I read Japanese lyrics, they seem so utterly like metaphorical to the extent that I literally can't like interpret it. And again, I don't speak any Japanese, so I'm just going off of the translation, but I was curious if you think that that bears out kind of in popular culture or even in poetry, that like when I'm again when I'm reading the lyrics for Japanese songs, they seem so like almost like magically metaphorical to the point where I literally don't know what it's saying sometimes. Is that just me being a weeb, or does that kind of pan out when you learn Japanese language a bit more? Is it more metaphorical than literal?
Yes. 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 So that's a very good question. I hesitate to look to artists to answer that question because metaphor is one of the colors that artists paint with whenever they make songs or poetry. You know what I mean? Like they're going to use it more than the average Joe. But that doesn't mean that what you're saying is untrue. Um, I think that it is very true that conversational everyday Japanese and even academic Japanese writing is very commonly very abstract and metaphorical rather than concrete and explanatory. Um, and I think that that's reflective um, of what we're talking about here. So um, I don't know. So I'm from the American Southeast, and the I guess you could say the everyday vernacular in the American Southeast is one that has been critiqued of beating around the bush, of not getting to the point, of not saying the quiet part out loud, of being very um, superficial and not concrete in how it talks about stuff. So we could take a common Southern expression like bless your heart. That's a very positive idea, right? If we take that literally, it's like, wow, that's such a nice thing to say, you know? But what it means is that person's a fucking idiot. You know what I mean? That's what that
Okay.
means. That's
Yeah.
what Southern people use that to say.
Okay, I see.
that,
Yeah.
that person is
I'm from
absolutely,
Chicago, so that one flew over my head a bit. I'll have to watch out for when people tell me that.
yeah. So, like American Southern language is very much like that in a lot of ways. It dances around the topic rather than just like diving right in. So, if you're saying to somebody, bless your heart, um, that is your socially negotiated, socially acceptable way to say, you're fucking stupid. Get out of my face. I hate you. Right. Um, and Japanese has also been called and has been compared to Southern, like American English, because it's very similar in this way. It's very common. And we actually learn this in Japanese language classes, by the way. Like, this is not something unique to my experience or to like scholars' experiences. Like, if you have ever learned Japanese in an academic setting or tried to, either in a class or on your own, this is something that you will often see. It's very common to, in everyday speech, drop off the, the clincher of the sentence. So here's an example. If someone wants to invite you out to dinner and you want to say no, obviously very rude, not good to just say, no, sorry. No, I don't want to. You don't say anything like that in Japanese. We don't do it in English either for the most part, but especially in Japanese, if someone says, hey, do you want to go out to dinner? Either friendly or a date or just whatever, and you're trying to say no somehow, you don't ever say the word no in response. What you're supposed to say is, um, a phrase that is very commonly taught in this response would be, chotto yoji ga atte. And that just means, oh, I kind of have something to do. And whenever it's written out, it's written with an ellipsis to indicate that it's an incomplete sentence. I have something kind of to do. And what you're leaving out is, so no. You're leaving out the clencher, the meaning of the sentence. You're leaving out the
Actual
obvious part.
answer.
Exactly. You're saying, I don't know, I kind of have some stuff to do. And you want them to understand and respond with, oh, I understand they're saying no. That's a turn down invitation. I get it. You don't ever actually say, iie, yoji ga arimasu, which would translate to, no, I've got stuff to do. You
Mm,
never say anything like that. That's like not the way to turn somebody down. You kind of act like you're being wishy-washy about it, even though you've already made up your mind. 5 p.m. I have some stuff I got going on. I don't know if I can do it.
sure.
You're supposed to act kind of bashful about it. And you never actually say, even though you've decided, you never say no. Um, and Chinese and Japanese academic work, even in the modern period, can be very similar in the fact that you don't really get to the thesis until you've read the whole thing. There's in English, especially in academia, you're supposed to have this thing called a thesis statement where you say what you're arguing for the entire textual work that you have written and what everything that is in that text is going to be in service of. That is your core argument. No such thing in Japanese. No such thing in Japanese academia. There is no thesis statement. That is not how academics are taught to write. It's not how they are taught to approach arguments and the subject of their research. There is no thesis statement ever given. If you want to know what the core argument is, you have to read the whole thing and think about it because there's going to be some beating around the bush. And just like I've been saying, the clincher is left out. The clincher where you actually get told what is being said is left out. And it's communicated in this roundabout way that you have to then infer. And it makes it a lot harder to read Japanese academic texts. If you gave me like a 30-page article to read, I could probably have it read for you by like noon tomorrow, right? In English. Um,
Mm.
and I could understand it. And I could be able to tell you the thesis statement and I can like give you quotations and notes and thoughts about it and all that stuff. If you gave me a 30-page Japanese article, you'd have to call me in like a month. I'd have to
Okay.
read it and I'd have to like, I mean, first of all, I'm slower at reading Japanese because I'm not 100% fluent. So there's going to be some use of dictionary, but also like I have to read it. I have to make notes. I have to sit and digest it and think about it. I have to go back to it. I have to look at those notes and I have to see if they're supported by what the text says. I have to like figure out what this weird metaphor or this weird grammatical dancing around the actual clincher thing is about, and I have to come back and then eventually after all that, then I could say, oh, I actually get what this is saying.
Sure. Sorry, the
Make sure you do so before 5:45. Thank you.
all right, Spanish. I'll talk loud. Roll with the punches. Yeah, so okay, I'll just wait. All right, sorry for that. Left brain is a little agitated because it likes constancy. It doesn't like being interrupted by the library telling me to leave in 30 minutes. Yeah, so that's very interesting. I actually did forget what I was going to say, but thank you for laying all that out.
Yeah. So that was the language side. And then you wanted to get to the religion side as well.
Yeah, yeah. It looks like we have about like 20 minutes left. But I think we could get something in for sure. So yeah, religion, our meat and potatoes. So I'd like to start with this note and then we can take it wherever. So I had sent something about okay. So I think this is interesting. And he said it in basically these terms. Concerning religion, Ian McGilchrist anticipates that the expression of and engagement with religion will over time in the West will over time become more explicit and yeah, more explicit in its content and expression and less capable of understanding and also expressing spirituality in subtle or nuanced terms. So in other words, he's saying religion's going to be very heavy-handed in the West over time as we become more left brain dominant. And yeah, so there was that. I thought that yeah, I won't say too much. I kind of just want to see what you have to think. The other thing, though, is that he gives a contradiction where he says that, and he talks about Heidegger and Wittgenstein. Heidegger's like one of those guys that's really important, but I still don't know that much about him, like Hegel. Anyway, he says that Heidegger, that viewing left brain dominance in this way, this very highly linguistic, conceptual, abstract way, we can almost view philosophy itself in the Western sense as an ailment or as an ill, where we get so wrapped up in thinking that we neglect the actual lived world of experience. And he says that that's kind of what's happening right now. Anyway, he also gives the antidote, quote unquote, that perhaps through philosophy, and I think Alan Watts said something like this one time, by basically taking things to their logical conclusion, you actually break free of the trap of over intellectualization or over philosophizing or whatever. And I thought of I just, and he said something else about Zen. So I know those are kind of different things, like being very explicit on the one hand and like over intellectualizing on the other. But I do think that there's something to be found in religion, and I just thought about it, and then I'll turn it over to you. So I could say a lot about this, but I'll just sum it up very quickly. I think one of the reasons that Zen works so much, to the extent that it does, or at least as it works in the stories, is because Japanese culture does seem to have this rigidity, this hierarchy of like everything is done a certain way. There's very certain, social rituals and whatever. And by building itself up in that way, it necessarily leads to its own kind of breaking free or seeing free from all of that through that very like rigid cultural veil, if that makes sense. Anyway, there's a lot to unpack there. Pick any or none of those topics as you like. And yeah, what do you think of the relevance of this text to the study of religion and Asian religion in particular, Buddhism, perhaps more particular, if you'd like?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So speaking to his claim that Western religion will become ever more heavy-handed and explicit, I think that that is very true and supported by sort of a lot more of the absolutism that we see, especially with like Christianity and Abrahamic religions in general, when it comes to like different ways of being. So it's kind of like speaking to the fact that there's these increasingly conservative and radical churches in Christianity and in Islam that say that like X is right and Y is wrong. And that's just how it is. And X is responsible for curing Y of its being wrong. And, this has implications when it comes to like women's rights, to like to LGBTQ rights, to all kinds of stuff. Like, no, God says there's only two genders. There is no other possibility. You are one or the other. Like that's an example of heavy-handedness and absolutism in its declarations. And that's supported by exactly what he says. It's supported by this like over dominance of the left side of the brain, and these increasingly categorical and increasingly alienative and increasingly othering, activities of the mind and of the brain. At the same time, there's some nuance to be found there when it comes to the role and the function that religion would serve or can or does serve in this framework. I think that religion on the whole in relation to this framework is actually possibly an escape from dominance of or over dominance of one side over the other. A lot of people especially in the last 100 years in the West, have sought religions that emphasize experiencing and feeling, interconnectedness and emotional attunement and pure experience that that occurs past the breakdown of language, logic, and reason. And a lot of people, you can kind of collectively call this like spirituality, but it entails things like Zen, things like Buddhism, things like yoga and Hinduism, things like outside of this very declarative and categorical and rigid structure of Western religion. And so I think that people do seek religion to live in the right brain, according to McGilchrist's diagnosis of what the right brain is and does. They kind of want to live in that right brain space for a while, because it feels better and it helps moderate the overdominance of the left over the right and contextualize and balance out everyday living. And so there's a very real aspect of religion playing that role in his framework. And I don't think that that is covered by his declaration that, it'll become ever more absolutist in its expression. That really applies to Abrahamic religions and is supported by recent history, but it ignores the fact that, like, also, if we're talking about religion's role in culture, we could say, based on your framework, that it functions in this possible way. So it definitely it exists as avenues for improving and creating meaning and context in life, and going past what we call the humdrum, the egotistical, categorical, othering kind of activity of our minds and our behavior, and goes into the interconnected and abstract in terms of like not having words to be able to attach to it, and these unique, you might call, mystical experiences. And then going past that, something else you mentioned about Japanese Buddhism in particular and Zen. Zen is a perfect example of a religion that makes a practice of doing just that, of going past over-intellectualizing activities of the mind, activities of the brain, into a space that is absent of language, absent of prescription, absent of all categorical and calculative thinking, and living there forever. That's kind of the goal, is to like live in that forever. So, and I think that there are philosophies out there too, like you say, like Heidegger and Wittgenstein and others, who they describe the world in a particular way, and they, in describing it in this particular way, find a way out of the constraints of that description. So you mentioned you might not be that familiar with Heidegger and Wittgenstein. I'm not as familiar with Wittgenstein, other than to know that he works considerably in philosophy of language, and specifically in like structures and functions of language. And so without knowing anything, I can imagine that that can become very prescriptive in terms of like describing that, language is the ultimate category through which the world should be viewed. But I'm more familiar with Heidegger, who is very famous for being an existentialist and a fundamental ontologist. For those familiar, he wrote, his most famous work is Being and Time. And that's basically describing this thing we're talking about, which is finding a way to be in the world in context and in sequence and in process. And it's a very complicated and dense text, but I think it kind of boils down nicely to that. And he, in this way, kind of goes through the phenomenal and breaks through it into this kind of ineffable way of living that is in process and in context, and the meaning arises as a result of those processes and contexts, rather than being phenomenal in itself. I think that that's kind of the important message of Being and Time, and of other sort of fundamental ontological works he's written, is that meaning is not phenomenal, it is emergent from process and from context rather than just being there, right? Because this whole question comes down, like the reason they endeavored on these projects and thought through these questions was like, they're like, what is the origin, the nature of meaning when it comes to life and being? And they were like, well, I'm looking for it in the phenomenon, in the phenomenal, and I'm not finding it. There's nothing there. And the answer comes from understanding phenomena in process and phenomena in context and being and living in that way. From that, meaning emerges organically, ineffably, and involuntarily even. It doesn't require creation or facilitation. That's just sort of how that's the meaning is in the continuation and in the going. So that's why Heidegger is often kind of compared to very Buddhist philosophies in scholarship. There's like very strong relationships between what he claims and what you can see in some Buddhist texts as well.
Yeah, awesome. That helps a lot. Yeah, I'll look into Heidegger more just because I want to, and he's one of the most talked about philosophers. If you study religion or just philosophy in general.
Can be very hard to read, so go with caution.
When I say study him, I mean watch a couple YouTube videos on someone who studied him way more and can break it
Yeah.
down simply for people like me. So, two questions. And I guess this is more personal. You said that there was something about no, I kind of lost it. Maybe you could find it. So if I personally look at history, I kind of see we started out as right brain oriented creatures. Religion was the first thing. I mean, really, if we're talking about science, philosophy, religion came first. I'm not saying that we need to grant primacy to religion necessarily just because it came first. But it seems like that's where we started. Um, and then it does seem that we get sucked into this very left brain dominant way of thinking. And yet out of that, we develop vaccines, increase our quality of life for billions around the world, even though we're not perfect and we're not all the way there yet. We've done a pretty good job. And that came through this striving, appetitive, left brain dominant way of thinking and being. And so, I'm not asking you as Nick, the divine omniscient, but I'm just asking at a personal level, do you kind of see the collective project of humanity as being that appetitive striving towards understanding nature, that we could make all this stuff, medicine, philosophy, all these things that improve our lives, but then eventually to return to that right brain, meaning oriented mode of being. And again, I'm not saying that that was necessarily the divine plan from the start, but even if it's not that per se, do you think that that's what it should be, or some version of that? Is
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
kind of what?
I definitely think that the human project going on now for a couple million years, I definitely think that on the one hand, yes, because history remains, it does not, occur and then go away. Because history remains, the actions of those who have expressed their appetitiveness have taken the collective to where we are now in many ways. But at the same time, it's impossible to think about human history, human culture, or the human collective in general without really thinking of the process involving both at the same time rather than just left, right? So I think that
Both what?
both hemispheres of the brain.
Okay.
I think it's like a balance if you collectivize and aggregate it all in the sense of like there are those few who do um, really this wonderful work that involves medicine, that involves food security, that involves technology, that improves our lifespan and our quality of life. Like those, there are those few that do that and are expressing the positive aspects of left brain over dominance. But then at the same
Yeah.
time, there are those few who interact and interface with culture in this more right brain oriented fashion and express the human experience, the meaning of life, the context of the individual in the collective through beautiful works of art and visual arts, music, writing, all of this sort of stuff. And I think that it's possible also for one to be, for it to be kind of a yin yang situation where there is some of the left in the right and some of the right in the left, where people like artists, for example, will sometimes have this sort of motivation of like, you know, I contribute to the world of art in the way that I do because it advances the human experiences in some way, or the human understanding of the human experience in some way. So they have this appetitive nature in their artistic practice and artistic participation. And then at the same time, those people who work on developing vaccines, life-saving medicines, on better food networks, on environmental preservation and maintenance, they then will also have this core motivation of like, and I do this because it reduces suffering, and I'm very empathetic to suffering. So, um, and I think McGilchrist would stick with this as well. This left and right brain thing is not a strict separated binary. There is always one in the other when it comes to the phenomenon of human behavior and the phenomenon of human experience. There is always the interrelationship and the interpenetration of both in our going forth in the world. And to that extent, it becomes actually that much harder for him to do his project of pulling apart the strands. Um, but ultimately, yeah, there is that, both in both principle at work.
Gotcha. Awesome. Yeah. I think that's a good way to summarize it. And yeah, our brains would bear that out. It's the left and the right working in conjunction. Even if you are super left brain dominant, it literally always needs the right brain. And yeah, well, sir, thank you very much. I think this is a super interesting text. I think it will probably be a text that I rely on like more than I probably anticipate right now. I really love this book. I'm glad that I was able to share it with you. Um, if you wanted to discuss like any other part of it, I'd be more than happy. I think I'm definitely going to read this book again, just so I can kind of immerse myself in it more. Um, but yeah, other than that, what did you have any um, particular theme that you'd like to work on next time? Um,
I think
for the
that this is an interesting kind of framework to go back and apply to other stuff that we've talked about and see if anything newer or interesting shakes out. For example, we've talked a lot about esoteric Buddhism and um, esoteric thinking in general when it comes to religion and philosophy. And we've talked a lot also about, for example, like why I'm not a Buddhist. That book, if you apply this framework to how that subject matter is approached, then we might come to new different conclusions about that material as well. So it's like this is something that you can take forward and backward, and I think it would be really interesting to do so because it does have these grand reaching implications.
For sure. Yeah. And I think Buddhism would be an awesome place to explore that. Well, I'll put this on the table. We had discussed the Sohei warriors of Japanese Buddhism, I think.
Mhm.
And I'm also just now starting the Chishin Lun, which is the awakening of faith in Mahayana Buddhism. So McGilchrist at the end of this chapter, we didn't really get into it, but he also discusses this notion of faith and its implications for philosophy, for science, for religion. and that's probably a different kind of, probably different than the Qixin Lun is exploring faith. But I think that the Qixin Lun is a very interesting text because faith is required for literally all religions. There's no religion where you're like, hey, yeah, I actually choose not to believe in God in Christianity or whatever. So just putting that on the table, we can decide later on as we talk. But yeah, if nothing else, Nick, it was a pleasure having you, and thanks for coming on.
Yes, it was a pleasure being on again, and I look forward to future discussions either with the Cixin Lun and Buddhism and McGilchrist or the Sohei as we get into some really fun, entertaining, like anime sounding history. These big giant super
Okay.
buff monk guys who, they're monks, but also they go around and carry 7 weapons, like, and, smash heads and dance across, topple bridges to go and cut off heads and stuff like that.
Ooh, okay. I'll have to play Sekiro before we talk, just to prime myself for that.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, Nick, it was good having you, and I'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye, guys.